Well, welcome to the seventh talk on world history. And this one, I want to really start to look at the history of the world in terms of human history. And primarily, this will be from the time of the flood up to the time of the ancient Greeks. And this is going to major on issues to do with ancient Egypt and also development of writing and the existence of cavemen. But before I do that, I just want to kind of, as it were, go over some of the material in the first six talks and do a quick resume of that. And to that, I'm just going to put up a PowerPoint. If you remember, in the first talk, I looked at the issue of revelation and how the Bible is a source of revelation. And as such, the only opportunity we have to have access to true truth. And I think that's a really important point to make at the outset. Otherwise, we would not understand why the Bible is central to our understanding of these things. So I'm just going to quickly load up the PowerPoint and get me back to the beginning. And yeah, revelation, the only source of knowledge guaranteed to be true. All other knowledge is, as it were, subject to uncertainty, and quite reasonably so. Now, if you remember, in order to understand whether or not we had revelation in terms of the Bible, there were two forms of proof. And I said one was miracles. And the following video clip is a good example of Professor Craig Keener's work on miracles. And if you want to copy that down, well recommend that. It's about 50 minutes long, and the last 30 minutes is a catalogue of miracles. But the first 20 minutes is an interesting look at the philosophy around miracles. And I think the argument for miracles has been much underplayed in academic circles. And I believe that in the last 50 years, there's been so many miracles, as Professor Craig Keener points out, that it is untenable to say that they don't exist. The other great argument for the Bible being a revelation from God is fulfilled prophecy. And that material I will come across and discuss in talks 8 to 12, because I believe that human history from the Greeks onwards to our present day is very often a product of something that God has prophesied beforehand. And this is really exciting. You know, it's one thing for God to heal people, that's amazing. But for him to make history to dance to his tune, well, that is truly an act of God. And again, it confirms the Bible as a record from God and an accurate one. And of course, that was the point of the next 5 talks, was how accurate is the Bible? Is it an accurate record of history? And of course, in the last 200 years, it's been the issue of chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis that have come under attack. One is the creation story plausible, and is the flood plausible? And so what I've tried to do is argue that, in fact, if you look at the evidence, the balance of probabilities very much works in favor of a worldwide flood. You know, it is very clear that you are dealing with something that makes sense in that particular realm. So if we looked at the issue of evolution, one would see that the mitochondrial DNA changes, which I mentioned by Jensen, suggest that there's only enough mutations there for thousands of years, not millions of years. There is an absence of beneficial mutations. The origin of the first cell seems to be utterly implausible by any evolutionary scenario. We have the issue of genetic entropy, where the decay of the code is clearly something that is inconsistent. We have the absence of transitional fossils. There doesn't seem to be any examples, really, of fossils changing from one kind of animal to another. Again, we have the absence of junk DNA. All the DNA appears to be fully functional. Then the big issue of irreducible complexity. There are some, what I call anomalous things, which you might say, like homology, that's the common shape of structure of the bones. But those things could equally be used for creation as for evolution. Likewise, natural selection works both for creation and for evolution, and adaptations. And actually, adaptations is an interesting one because there's real evidence now that adaptations are not the product of mutations, but the product of mechanisms already inside the genetic code where things can be switched on or switched off according to environmental constraints. So, for instance, Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands may not, in fact, be the product of natural selection working on mutations, but actually the product of the finch's genetic code switching on and switching off according to the environmental constraints. Now, this is certainly a new part of biology, and I wouldn't want to speak authoritatively on that, but it does seem to be that these changes take place within 1 or 2 generations, which isn't something that you'd expect if it was a slow, gradual process. As regards the balance of probabilities for a recent universe, if one looks at the data that I showed, there was a number of examples which I looked at. Saturn's disks were unstable, geological activity on the moons, Type 3 supernova, existence of spiral galaxies, existence of comets, the strength of the planetary magnetic fields, too many blue stars, and missing population 3 stars. All these things are consistent with a recent universe, but they're not consistent with an old universe. But obviously, there's the starlight and time problem, which is something that you could argue for an old universe. But I suggest that when you look at all these other evidences, compare them to that, the balance of probabilities works in that direction. And I think I've missed something out here. The age of the rocks, yes. And obviously, I started off, if you remember, by looking at the age of the rocks. And I said to you that the landforms are better explained by the floodwaters running off the Earth than by slow, gradual processes. The bending of rock layers with no signs of cracks is much more consistent with rocks being still wet from the flood, or there are no signs of erosion between rock layers, which suggests they're all laid down at the same time. Polystrate fossils that go through many layers, suggesting those layers are all getting laid down in one catastrophic event. Carbon-14 found in diamonds and coal and fossils, and also in soft tissue in fossils. And I think that's a really big one, soft tissue in fossils. And I've seen some of the attempts to explain away how we find soft tissue in fossils that are millions of years old. And their explanations are really very far-fetched and probably implausible to the point of impossible on so many levels. And I think one has to be careful. Just because somebody comes up with what they say is an explanation for something doesn't mean it's either true or it's even possible. So I think the soft tissue in fossils is a very, very major argument. Obviously, there's the issue of radiometric dating, which I think is fair point, and that's why I put it on this side of the scales. But as I'm trying to point out, that the scales are definitely weighted towards a recent past for the rocks. Now, that's my, as it were, summary. One other point I wanted to make here, actually, this carbon-14 in fossils. If you remember, I discussed why the academic response, or I discussed not why, I just discussed that the academic response to all this information has been lacking, and when it has existed, it has been no rigor to it. They haven't read the material. There's another thing that's going on here, and a friend of mine, Professor Steve Taylor from Liverpool University, has experienced this. If you try to produce a paper that, as I say, promotes something that suggests the Earth is young, you're unlikely to get it published in an academic journal. Even though your information may all be valid and correct, you have to go to some lengths to get it published. And Professor Steve Taylor had done work on carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. And it took years for this work to get published because, in a sense, it was just the sort of information they didn't want to see, because if there's carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone, that would suggest a dinosaur bone's only thousands of years old. So if you say, well, what about the academic papers? Where's the academic papers supporting your point? Well, the problem is they wouldn't get published. And speaking from a professor at a British university, Russell Group University, it's quite clear that if he's struggling to get a paper published, even though the data and all the information is valid, you can imagine it's going to be very difficult to get any papers published because the whole system is controlled by people who don't want to have that type of work published. And if you think that's a bit of a conspiracy theory, well, this is also applied to non-Christian fields of science where there's been a dominance by one group of thinking. It's almost called institutional capture. And so you see this with the Big Bang Theory, and I mentioned that earlier, that many scientists who don't think the Big Bang Theory is correct have argued that they can't get published, they can't get positions, they can't get funding. And funny enough, I came across this with somebody who was arguing against string theory in physics. And he wrote a book where he said the same thing. People who don't believe in string theory in physics can't get published, they can't get money for research, and they can't get professorships. So this principle whereby ideas that are not popular in the academic world simply don't get the oxygen needed to be discussed in academia is not just restricted to creation science. It is actually a common feature in many of the more speculative areas of science. Now I'm going to move over to the area I said I was going to discuss today, which was the ancient civilizations. So I'll go to this balance of probabilities again. When we come to look at the ancient world, and that's really the world from the time of the flood up into Greece, there's probably one very important point to make. Sadly, we have very little information about this time. And that's because many of these civilizations did have history books, but they have been lost, and understandably so. In fact, it is remarkable the Bible ever survived it, because there is a tendency for all history to die out with the civilization. There's probably no reason why a succeeding civilization will want to retain the history of the past. But there's a further reason, and that is we tend to find that civilizations get overthrown by their enemies, and the enemies are almost certainly unlikely to preserve the history of the people they just conquered. And so we do find that ancient records do exist, because we hear people referring to them, but they have often been lost in the mists of time. And it was Herodotus who said about the Egyptians, when he was writing in 400 BC, around about then, that the priests that he spoke to in Egypt seemed to have very little knowledge of their own history. And that's not surprising, since the Persians and the Cambyses had basically destroyed much of the Egyptian temples and Egyptian artifacts. And so there's every reason to believe that this has been replicated throughout the ancient world. So when we come to look at ancient history, don't be surprised if we have very little information to go by. And again, it does suggest that the Bible is an amazing book to have survived so long. What we do find, which is very interesting, is that the oldest recorded history tends to be about 5,000 years old. If we put to one side the carbon-14 found in ancient artifacts and the narratives we tend to have that people construct of 8,000 and 10,000 years, and put them to one side and just look at what we see in terms of written records, it is very consistently the case that they only go back about 5,000 years, to about 3000 BC. And we also find that these civilizations are found in the Middle East. These are quite consistent with a recent past for human history. And the first civilizations being the Middle East is quite consistent with that's where the flood landed Noah's Ark, and that's where the first humans would have settled, and from there spread out. And what we do find is quite an interesting thing with writing. Writing tends to be more complex the further back in time you go. And that's interesting, because one would have expected, if writing evolved, that the writing in the past would have been simpler and we would be more complex. But that's not the case. Things like Sanskrit are very complex writing systems. Likewise of languages. we do find that languages are very complex things with great deal of grammar and a great deal of, things that we who speak English hardly have any of. We may have lots of words, but we certainly do not have grammar that's very sophisticated. And this is a surprise, because back in the Victorian periods, when people kind of criticizing the Bible, one of the things they said, Moses couldn't have written the Old Testament, the first 5 books, because they didn't know how to write in those days, 1500 BC. Well, they hadn't spotted that it was cuneiform going to be coming up in terms of huge amounts of cuneiform found in Mesopotamia, nor did they realize that the hieroglyphics on the walls of Egyptian temples were actually writing systems and not just pretty pictures. And so we quickly had to change our mind that writing exists. And in fact, really, from the very dawn of the cities, the earliest cities were sophisticated. The Chaldees is as sophisticated as any city that you would expect to find in Roman times or in times of almost the Middle Ages. It really isn't in the last 300 years that we find cities growing in sophistication dramatically. So there's every reason to believe that the earliest humans were very intelligent and had very sophisticated writing and very sophisticated languages. In fact, I would probably argue that those writing systems and those languages originated at the Tower of Babel, and that God gave them as a supernatural gift. Now, I can't prove that, but I think that makes the most sense, that God would have given people the writing systems and the ability to speak different languages with great sophistication. And being humans, we've kind of made them simpler and simpler as time goes by. Therefore, when we talk about cavemen and people who are illiterate, that is something that is a question of people losing their language and losing the written language. And it's very easy to lose the ability to read and to write. All you have to do is not provide any education. And education tends to be associated with cities and towns and civilizations that are keeping together and genuinely have the ability to pass on what's quite a sophisticated skill. And obviously, you can see how it's very easy to lose that skill and, in a sense, become a caveman. So I think the original humans were not cavemen. They were sophisticated people, knew how to write, knew how to read, and so they lost that from time to time, and that's how you tended to find that a lot of these languages were lost. One of the interesting facts about the past is that many of the tribes around the world have a common flood story. So in every continent, there tends to be this narrative about a flood. And I think that also speaks to the truth of the worldwide flood. In fact, Josephus, writing around about 70 AD, describes in his history of the world the flood. And in his description of the flood, he refers in his commentary to the fact that the Greeks and the Romans also knew there was a worldwide flood, and so did the Mesopotamians. And so Josephus didn't have to prove there's a worldwide flood or try and convince his readers. They knew from their own histories there was a worldwide flood. So far, so good. However, it would be unfair to say that ancient civilizations entirely agree with the Bible. And here we come to the issue of ancient Egypt. The reason why I say that is because this is one of the civilizations whose history we have, in a sense, anchored all other histories around. So the chronology, the dating system for ancient Egypt, tends to be the chronology that we use to date every other civilization. So what dates we give to Egypt will determine what dates we give to these other civilizations. And I really want to conclude this talk by looking at a debate that has gone on over this matter. Because what they found was that the dates just didn't match. You couldn't find the Exodus and you couldn't find the conquest. These are dated about 1500 BC in Egyptian chronology. Now, one sort of interesting example of this was when Jericho was first excavated. The initial excavations seemed to confirm the Bible. There was these walls that had fallen down with an earthquake. The city had been destroyed, and there was just one section of wall that didn't fall. This sounded very like the story that we were discussing in Joshua, where basically the walls fell down and there was just one part of the city walls that remained, where Rahab was. And so initially everyone was very excited about this, until they dated that particular site using Egyptian chronology, and it didn't work out. It didn't seem to be the right time. So is the issue that Egyptian chronology is out? I'm going to look at this in a little bit, but I can't say for certain this is the case. All I can say is there is a debate, and I can point you to the debate, and it's very much up to others to work out the details. I wish there would be more research done on this, but again, academia tends to be reluctant to countenance differences of opinions in certain areas, and this one has been one of those examples. This all started really with a person called Emanuel Velikovsky. He wrote in the 1950s this book, Ages and Chaos. Now, the problem with Emanuel Velikovsky, he was a psychiatrist, and he wasn't really an archaeologist, and therefore his sort of ideas, understandably, were not treated entirely with respect. However, there were enough archaeologists who did think that there was something in his ideas to pursue them. And what Velikovsky said was that actually, if you look at the IPWA papers that we knew existed, they are some Egyptian papers from the end of the 13th dynasty. Now, just to give you a little bit of a clue as to what's going on here, is that you have the Middle Kingdom and you have the New Kingdom, and the 13th and 12th dynasties are situated in the Middle Kingdom, and then you have the 18th, 19th, 20th dynasties in the New Kingdom. And between them is a sort of hiatus, often called where the Hyksos take over Egypt, and you have a wholly different set of pharaohs. Now, Velikovsky argued that the evidence seemed to point that the IPWA papers describe the collapse of the 13th dynasty, and the sorts of plagues and disasters that they describe could be seen as the plagues and disasters of the Exodus. The only problem is that that is a period of history that's something like 500 years adrift from 1500 BC, and therefore you wouldn't associate it with the Exodus. However, if you could change the dating system of Egypt, then you would have a situation where you would have the end of the 13th dynasty being the time of the Exodus. And I think that's a really crucial point that we will see played out in the next few books I'm going to talk about. From Velikovsky's ideas, a number of people got very interested in this. There were sort of organizations set up, Chronos and SIS, who explored these possibilities. I think they generally came to the conclusion that some of Velikovsky's ideas were not workable. He thought that Hatshepsut was the Queen of Sheba and Thutmose III was Shishak, who was the one who took over or took the temple under the reign of Rehoboam. Leaving to one side Velikovsky, he's a good read, but put him to one side for the moment. One other person who took up this particular cause was de Corville, a Seventh-day Adventist person from Loma Linda University in California. And he wrote a book called The Exodus Problem. And he looked at, quite interestingly, how you could absorb the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom and get rid of the first sort of hiatus, which is a period of about 1,000, 1,500 years. And he said that this could be done by saying that there was actually dual kingdoms going on, that not every kingdom was actually a standalone kingdom by itself, but they were actually kingdoms within kingdoms. And the reason why you can do this is because, to some extent, the king lists that we build up our dynasties from come from certain readings of Manetho. And there's reason to believe that maybe he wasn't an entirely accurate historian himself, writing around the time of Christ. I can't remember if it was just before or after Christ, but it was many years after the kingdoms that he's referring to. And as I said, Herodotus was of the opinion that the priests had lost their knowledge. So where did Manetho get his information from? We don't know. So I think it is reasonable to say that Manetho may not be the be-all and end-all of all knowledge on this matter. So we have Badakovsky, we have de Courville, and they both argue that you should put the Exodus at the end of the 13th dynasty, just before the Hyksos arrived. More recently, David Rohl published this book, A Test of Time, and it was actually made into a Channel 4 series. And he is roughly doing the same thing about the Exodus, but he intriguingly has Joseph as being a character from the 12th dynasty. And he points out that there's actually a statue in a city of Ramesses, and he says that this city wasn't always called Ramesses, but this particular city was a city that had an Asiatic group of people, and that Asiatic group of people is what we would call Hebrews. They were not Egyptians, and these people left suddenly. And that would look like the Exodus. And we'll come across that particular scenario in another book, another film, which was called Patterns of Evidence. And this is a documentary maker who picked up on David Rohl's position, and some other people like Binson, who have argued that the conquest makes a lot of sense if you set it in this period around the end of the 13th dynasty, because you have a lot of the cities and towns mentioned in the Bible being destroyed at that point, which was consistent with what the Bible talks about in the invasion of Joshua. And so the Patterns of Evidence says this. It says, if you're looking for a pattern of what to look for, it would be a group of Asiatics in the capital of Egypt who start off prosperous, but then become poor, become slaves, but they also increase rapidly. So the settlement of Asiatics becomes more and more. Then you would expect the Asiatics to disappear overnight. And you would expect there to be a corresponding invasion of Canaan. And if you put all these things together, you do find such a pattern in the 12th and 13th dynasties. You find this particular establishment of Asiatic people, including that statue that I mentioned, which looks like it's of Joseph. And you have this Asiatic community suddenly disappearing. And you have the corresponding invasion of Canaan some 50 years later. And that's why it's called a Patterns of Evidence. And I do find this very interesting. One final book, Centuries of Darkness by Peter James. This book is interesting because in this book, it also argues for something similar, though not necessarily referring to the Exodus in the way that I've referred to, but it does argue that Egyptian history needs to be reduced. I think in this case by about 250 years. And the argument here is quite sophisticated because it says the reason why it needs to be reduced is because if you look at Greek history, you look at Nubian history, which is basically Sudan, if you look at Mesopotamian history, which is sort of Iraq and all that part of the world, and Hittite history, which is Turkey, all of those histories show gaps of around about 250 to 300 years, which look like those gaps have arrived because they're dependent upon upon Egyptian history. In other words, what he's saying is if you could reduce the history of Egypt by 250 years, you could make sense of the rest of the histories of the surrounding nations. And that would make sense. If you have falsely elongated Egyptian history, then you would expect that to have an effect upon all the other histories who depend upon Egypt for as it were, their dating systems. And there is actually a website, Centuries of Darkness, where he tries to keep up to date on this, but he hasn't done too much work recently, and which is why I really would love the Bible societies and the Bible colleges to do some work on this, and to consider it. And sadly, many, I think, of the Bible colleges do not know that such a debate exists. And so therefore, when they're teaching their students about the Old Testament, they're kind of leaving them with only the traditional chronology of Egypt. Now, I know people like Kenneth Kitchen believe the traditional chronology of Egypt is perfectly satisfactory. I don't think that is the case. I think that actually does require a close looking and potential revising of those dates. Now, that brings to an end my talk on ancient civilizations, because I want to really move on to a period of history where we do know things for much more certain, and that's the period of the Greeks and the Romans. And so my next talk will be about them, and we begin to see some interesting developments, both in fulfilled prophecy, as I said, but also maybe in what God was doing and saying through these civilizations. So that's for my next talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I will need to kind of close down the system, as it were, and be able to get back to talking about these things. So I just need to not the greatest one for being able to close down systems. Still learning, I might say. Still learning. Thank you for listening.